Today, I want to share with you a story about a man who thought his life had already ended, and about the frightened woman and starving infant who proved he still had a purpose in this world. The sun was sinking behind the Arizona borderlands, turning the desert into a sea of copper fire. Evening came slowly out here, slow enough for a man to hear the truth in his own footsteps. And on that quiet night, a man named Calder Greyhawk walked alone through a narrow wash with a bundle of herbs slung over his shoulder. Calder had lived many years in solitude. Once, he'd been a respected healer among his people, but loss had taken nearly everything from him. The desert had become the only place where his memories didn't speak too loudly. Here, with only the wind and the earth beneath his boots, he could breathe. He stopped to examine a patch of brittle sage. Trimming it carefully with a worn blade, the scent rose sharp and grounding, the kind of smell that reminded him of his grandmother's stories of spirits who walked with those brave enough to listen. But then, the desert changed. The wind paused. The birds fell silent. And from somewhere above the cliffs came a sound so thin, so fragile, he almost mistook it for the cry of the wind slipping through narrow stone. Calder looked up, brows drawn tight. There it was again, a tremble, a wail, a sound that didn't belong in the mouth of the desert. That is no coyote, no night bird. He stood completely still, listening with the patience of a hunter and the heart of a healer. A child. The realization struck him with a jolt. A baby's cry, weak, fading, desperate. Calder slung his herbs behind him and started up the rocky trail. The cliffside rose steeply, twisting through thorny brush and jagged stone. Each step carried the cry clearer, a high, trembling sound broken by tiny gasps. Whoever was up there didn't have much strength left. Near the top, he came upon an old cave he hadn't entered since he was a boy, a place where his people once took shelter during monsoon storms. Now it sat like an open mouth in the rock, dark and cold. Calder crouched at the entrance. The smell of fear and dust drifted out. He lit a small twist of yucca fiber, letting its faint glow spill across the stone. The crying grew louder. He stepped inside. Shadows clung to the walls, tightening around him as he moved deeper. Then the light touched a shape, a bundle of movement pressed into the far corner. A woman. She was filthy, trembling, her dress torn at the seams. Her hair hung in dusty clumps around her face. And in her shaking arms she clutched a tiny infant whose cries ricocheted off the cave walls like broken glass. The moment she saw Calder, she recoiled violently. Her back hit the stone. She snatched up a rock with a hand so weak it barely held the weight. "Stay back," she rasped, her voice rough from thirst and fear. Calder froze. He didn't raise his hands, didn't move closer. He lowered the flame instead, letting her see the gentleness in his stance. The baby let out a sharp, painful cry, a sound that carried hunger, exhaustion, and despair. Calder slowly reached to his belt and placed a water skin on the ground between them. "I won't harm you," he said softly. The woman's breath shuddered. She pressed the infant closer, rocking him with trembling arms. Tears cut thin lines through the dust on her cheeks. "Please, don't touch us," she whispered. Calder didn't answer with words. Instead, he knelt on the cold stone floor, bowed his head for a brief moment, and then pushed the water skin a little closer, using only 2 fingers. No force, no threat, only an offering. And there, in the darkness of an old canyon cave, 3 lives hung in silence, 1 man kneeling in peace. one woman shaking in fear, and a starving child whose cry had pulled fate into motion. Calder didn't rush her. He stayed there on his knees in the cave, the small flame flickering between them, until the woman's white-knuckled grip on the rock began to loosen. The baby's cries had turned into weak hiccups, the kind that made Calder's chest ache just to hear, slowly, as if every movement cost her something. The woman reached for the water skin. She grabbed it too fast, spilling some down the front of her torn dress. She drank in short, disparate pulls, like someone who wasn't sure when she'd be allowed another sip. When she finally pulled it away, she pressed a few drops to the baby's lips, whispering broken little shushing sounds that did nothing to calm her shaking. She still hadn't told him her name. He still hadn't asked. In a land like this, names came after survival. "Come," Calder said quietly. "You and the child will freeze if you stay here." She stiffened, pulling the baby closer, eyes wide and wild in the lamplight. He could see the war inside of her fear on one side, exhaustion and mother's instinct on the other. "I won't hurt you," he said. "You have my word." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the baby's frail breathing. At last, she nodded once, barely more than a tremor of her chin. Calder rose and turned toward the cave entrance, leaving a respectful space between them. He did not offer his hand. He did not touch her. He simply held the light, leading the way. She followed, stumbling, one arm wrapped around that tiny bundle of life pressed tight against her chest. Outside, the desert had darkened to a deep blue, the last streaks of color fading along the horizon. The air had taken on that sharp, cutting cold that sinks into bone. As they picked their way down the rocky path, the woman slipped once on loose gravel and caught herself with a muted gasp. Careful not to jostle the baby, Calder glanced back. "Steady," he murmured. "We're close." She didn't answer, but she kept moving. At the base of the cliffs, a stand of cottonwoods rose like silent guardians along a dry creek bed. Among their trunks sat a small adobe hut, low and plain, smoke curling thinly from its chimney. It was no ranch house, no fine estate, just a one-room shelter built by a man who expected nothing more than to stay alive. To Calder, it was enough. To her, tonight, it was a miracle. He pushed open the wooden door and stepped aside to let her enter first. Warmth spilled out, humble, but real. The faint scent of wood smoke and dried herbs wrapped around them like a blanket. Inside, the hut was simple, a hearth with a small fire still glowing, a narrow cot, a rough table, shelves lined with clay jars and bundles of plants hanging from the rafters. The woman stopped, just inside the threshold, unsure, clutching the baby so tightly that Calder could see her knuckles once again turn white. "You can sit by the fire," he said. "The cold has had enough of you today." She moved toward the hearth like someone walking in a dream and sank to her knees, back against the wall, baby still held protectively against her chest. The child whimpered, then let out another thin cry. Calder went to the shelves without another word. His movements were quiet and sure, the practiced gestures of a man who had spent years tending to the sick and the helpless. He poured water into a clay pot, added a small measure of goat's milk he'd bartered for the week before, and a pinch of ground herb to make it easier for a weak stomach to keep down. The mixture warmed slowly over the fire. As it heated, he glanced at the woman out of the corner of his eye. Her shoulders shook now and then, as if she were fighting back sobs that refused to stay down. The baby's tiny hands flexed weakly, reaching for something that wasn't there. When the milk was ready, Calder poured a little into a small cup and knelt in front of her, careful to keep a respectful distance. "This will sit kinder in his belly," he said. "Let him take it a little at a time." Her gaze flicked from his face to the cup, mistrust and hope fighting hard in her eyes. Then she reached out, fingers trembling, and took it from him. She touched the rim to the baby's lips, whispering, "Come on, sweetheart, please, please." At first, the child only mouthed at it, too tired to understand. Then instinct took over. His tiny mouth latched, drawing in the warm liquid, swallowing in small, greedy gulps. The sound of it, of a baby finally feeding, filled the little hut like a prayer being answered. The woman's face crumpled. The relief was so raw, so complete, that Calder had to look away to give her the dignity of her tears. He's eating," she choked out. "Oh, thank God, he's eating. You both will," Calder said. In a moment, he rose and ladled a bowl of thick corn stew from a pot resting near the coals. It wasn't much corn. Beans. A bit of dried meat, but it was hot and filling. He set it beside her on the floor. Within reach, but not forced. "Eat," he told her softly. "Food for you is food for him." She stared at the bowl as if it were a trick, some cruel joke the desert had decided to play. Then the smell reached her, a smell that spoke of warmth, of hearth and home, of everything she'd been missing for too long. She shifted the baby carefully, letting him rest against her shoulder as he dozed, half full and exhausted. With her free hand, she picked up the spoon. The first bite was tiny, almost cautious. The second was not. She ate with the quiet urgency of someone who had gone far too long on far too little. Tears slipping down her cheeks, dripping into the stew. She tried to hide them, turning her face toward the wall. But her shoulders told the truth. Calder didn't speak. He fed the fire, adjusted a pot, busied his hands with nothing, tasks that gave her space to break without eyes on her. Out here, a person's tears were like blood. They told a story. But no one had the right to demand it before its time. When the bowl was empty and the baby had drifted into a heavy sleep, the woman sagged against the wall. Spent, the lines of fear were still carved into her face. But the edge of panic had dulled, replaced by something more fragile and more dangerous. "Hope, thank you," she whispered, so quietly he almost missed it. Calder nodded once. "Rest. The night is long, but it won't touch you in here." She looked as if she wanted to say more, that some confession, some explanation, hovered on her tongue, but then her eyes closed, lashes still wet, and exhaustion claimed her before the words could. Calder pulled a blanket from the cot and laid it gently over her legs, careful not to disturb the child tucked against her chest. Then he crossed to the door and sat down with his back to it, knife within reach, ears open to every shift of the wind outside. The desert night pressed in around the little adobe hut, cold and vast. Coyotes called somewhere in the distance. A gust of wind rattled the dry branches of the cottonwoods. Inside, the only sounds were the soft crackle of the fire and the slow, uneven breaths of a woman who had been running for far too long, and the faint, steady whisper of a baby's breathing. Stronger now than it had been in that cave. Calder stared into the embers. his face calm, his body still, but his senses sharp as flint. Sleep did not come for him. It hadn't, not truly. In years, tonight was no different. He kept watch at the door, silent, patient, unmoving, the kind of quiet guardian the world rarely sees. But every frightened heart secretly prays for. Outside, danger tightened its circle somewhere out in the dark. Inside, under one weathered roof, 3 lives rested inside the thin circle of his protection. Dawn crept into the world quietly, as though afraid to disturb the fragile peace inside Calder Greyhawk's small adobe shelter. Thin ribbons of pale gold slipped through the cracks in the walls, touching the floor, the hearth, the cot, and finally the sleeping forms of the woman and her child curled beneath a blanket. Calder had not slept. He rarely did. But this morning, he watched the light grow with a different kind of stillness. One shaped not by loneliness, but by responsibility. When the woman stirred at last, blinking wearily as the new day settled around her, her first instinct was to clutch the baby tight. But Samuel, warm and full for the first time in days, let out a soft, contented sigh and burrowed closer against her, his tiny fingers curling in the fabric of her dress. The look on her face, raw relief mixed with disbelief, was something Calder felt deep inside his chest. "Morning comes slow in this valley," he said quietly. She startled, then relaxed just a little. He slept. He needed it." Calder answered. His voice was gentle, steady. "So did you." She didn't reply, but she didn't look away either. Calder rose and filled a small bowl with warm water from the pot by the hearth. He placed it near her, then stepped back, allowing her space. Evelyn wet a cloth and brushed it across her baby's cheeks. The grime from days of running came away in streaks. Calder handed her a small pouch of herbs to mix with the water. "That will soothe his skin," he murmured. She hesitated before taking it. "Thank you." Calder nodded. And together, without speaking, they washed Samuel as the morning sun widened across the desert. The child fussed once or twice, but mostly he stared at the new light with half-lidded eyes, as if discovering the world again. When Samuel was wrapped in a clean scrap of cloth and dozing against her shoulder, Evelyn drew a slow breath. Calder felt the shift in the air the moment the weight she carried grew too heavy to hold any longer. Her fingers tightened around the sleeping baby. "I should tell you," she stopped, swallowed hard. "You deserve to know what trouble you've taken into your home." Calder didn't speak. He folded his arms across his chest and waited. Not with pressure, but with patience. She stared into the fire for a long time before words finally came. "His name is Barrett Doyle," she whispered. "He owns a ranch 3 days north. A big place. Big enough that no one tells him no." Her voice trembled. "I worked in his kitchen. I'd been there almost a year." Calder's jaw tightened, but he made no sound. Her next breath came shuddering. "One night, he came to my room. No reason, no warning, no mercy. And afterward," her voice cracked, "afterward he told me I'd better keep quiet if I wanted to keep my job." The fire popped softly, the only reaction in the room, when I realized I was carrying his child. She continued. "I was terrified, but I kept working. I had nowhere else. And when Samuel was born, I hoped he'd just pretend we didn't exist." She wiped a tear away with the heel of her hand. "But he didn't. He wants the baby. Not because he cares." Her gaze hardened with grief. because he worries someone will find out what he did. A powerful man with a bastard child doesn't look good in town. So he said he'd take the baby, hide him somewhere, give him away if he had to. Calder felt a coldness settle beneath his ribs. And you ran, he said quietly. I ran, she whispered, with nothing but desperation and a prayer. She looked at Calder, then really looked, searching his face for judgment, for disgust, for disbelief. She found none, only the calm, steady silence of a man who had heard more pain in his lifetime than anyone should, and who carried his own kind of grief beneath his skin. Evelyn drew a shaky breath. I know how it sounds. But he has men everywhere, riders who track for him, who do whatever he asks. Once they find our trail, he won't stop until he owns everything he touches. Calder finished. Her lip trembled. Yes. Calder's eyes softened, though his voice remained steady as stone. You think I don't believe you? He asked. I do. She blinked fast, tears pooling but not falling. He continued. Quieter now. I've known men like Barrett Doyle, men who think the earth and every soul on it was made for their use. He paused, the edge of old memory moving behind his eyes. I failed someone once, someone who ran from a man like that. By the time I found her, it was too late. The words were simple, but the ache beneath them was deep and long-worn. Shaped by years of regret, Evelyn's voice broke. I'm sorry. Calder shook his head. No, you didn't cause that wound. He looked at the sleeping child. But maybe I can choose differently this time. Evelyn swallowed, hardly daring to breathe. What do you mean? She whispered. Calder stepped closer, not too close, just enough for his presence to steady the air around them. I'll get you to safety, he said, each word firm and certain. Both of you. For a moment, she didn't speak. She only covered her mouth with her hand as a sob escaped her, not loud, but helpless. The kind that comes from a heart stretched to its breaking point. Calder looked toward the doorway, where the morning light had brightened to gold. The desert is wide, he murmured, and the men hunting you are already moving. But they haven't crossed this threshold yet. He glanced back at her. And as long as you're under this roof, Evelyn Hart, they won't. In that small adobe hut, beneath the rising sun, something quiet and powerful settled into the space between them. Not romance, not yet, but trust beginning to bloom in the scorched ground of two wounded lives. And outside, somewhere far beyond the cottonwoods, the desert wind carried the faint whisper of hoofbeats, drawing slowly nearer. Dawn had barely finished stretching itself across the valley when Calder stepped outside to breathe the morning air. The light was soft, still blue at the edges, gold in the middle, quiet in that way the desert only is, before heat and trouble. Wake up. Inside the small adobe hut, Evelyn was settling Samuel against her shoulder, humming something too soft for words. Calder crouched near the door, letting his fingers trail along the ground as he always did, reading the earth the way another man might read a letter. Most mornings the tracks he found were nothing but deer prints or the winding marks of snakes that hunted by moonlight. But not today. Today the earth held something far heavier. Hoof prints. Fresh. Several sets. The fine hairs along the back of his neck lifted. He brushed sand aside with his knuckles, tracing the edges of one print. Deep, wide, left by a horse carrying weight, maybe two riders, or a big man with gear. And the direction, coming from the north, from the river crossing. His chest tightened. They had crossed. He rose and walked back toward the hut. Each step steady but quick. Evelyn looked up the moment he stepped inside. Something in his face must have told her everything. "What is it?" she whispered, clutching Samuel closer. "Riders," Calder said quietly. "Fresh tracks. More than one." Her breath hitched. "His men, they came across the river last night," he said. "They're searching the land. They'll find this place sooner than we expected." The color drained from her face. Calder, "What do we do?" He was already gathering what little they owned, a pair of water skins, a roll of dried meat, several tightly wrapped bundles of herbs. He moved quickly, but not frantically. His calm steadiness filled the room, grounding her even as terror surged through her chest. "We go south," he said, "toward the ridge. It's rough country. They won't expect us to take that way." Evelyn rose unsteadily, her tease weak beneath her. She clutched Samuel close. I'm ready. Just tell me what to do." Calder took the baby gently from her arms. Samuel whimpered once at the shift, then settled as Calder tucked him into a sling made of woven cotton and soft leather. The infant's tiny head rested against his chest. Evelyn stared at them this tall. Scarred Apache healer with her child, pressed close to his heart, and something inside her cracked open. A strange mix of gratitude and fear, and something deeper, something unnamed, washed through her. "Stay close behind me," Calder said softly. He led her outside, where his horse, Coyote Moon, waited under the cottonwoods. The old buckskin mare lifted her head and snorted softly. Sensing urgency in the air, Calder checked her saddle, tightened the straps, and helped Evelyn mount. Only when she was steady did he swing up behind her. The baby snugged between them. Calder made a soft clicking sound, and Coyote Moon started forward at a swift but careful pace. Hooves kicking dust from the dry creek bed, the shelter disappeared behind them. Swallowed by trees and stone, Evelyn kept her hands tight around Calder's forearm. She could feel the muscles beneath his shirt. The tension there controlled, but real. He was listening for everything: wind shifts, hoofbeats, danger hidden in open spaces. "What if they're close?" she asked. Her voice trembled despite her best efforts. "They are," Calder said, "but we're moving first." The desert stretched wide in every direction, an ocean of sand, sagebrush, and scattered stone. The morning sun rose higher, painting the land in gold and heat. Calder kept them to a narrow wash that ran like a dry scar across the flats. Weaving through low brush, Evelyn forced herself to look behind them. At first she saw only stillness. Then her heart froze. Far in the distance, a puff of dust lifted into the air. Then another, faint, but unmistakable. "Calder, there." Her voice was barely a breath. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He felt the shift in the wind, the tremor of hooves moving over distant ground. "I know," he said. The single, calm sentence steadied her in a way nothing else could have. But the fear still clawed inside her chest. "They're closer than we thought," she whispered. "Closer than they should be." Calder murmured. "Means they moved through the night. Means they're not tracking, they're hunting." Samuel stirred in the sling, sensing the tension. Calder placed a gentle hand over the child's back. "You hold on to me," he said to Evelyn, voice low. "Don't look behind anymore. I'll watch." She nodded and pressed her forehead lightly against his shoulder for a heartbeat. As if borrowing strength from the man who had given her nothing but safety since the moment they met, Coyote Moon quickened her pace. sensing Calder's urgency. The horse knew the land as well as her rider. She moved with instinct, weaving through patches of rock and dry scrub, heading toward the distant line of rising hills. The wind carried dust, and the faintest echo of something dreadful shouted orders. Metal striking against metal. The angry cries of men determined to reclaim what they believed belonged to them. Calder's voice cut through the fear like a blade made of calm iron. "We're ahead of them now," he said, "and we're going to stay that way." Evelyn tightened her grip, her breath trembling. "But will we make it?" Calder leaned forward, giving Coyote Moon the signal to push harder. "We will," he said, "because I won't let them take you. Or him." The horse surged into a faster run. Behind them, the dust plume grew wider, darker, closer, and the chase began in earnest, riders on the wind closing in. The desert rushing past, a mother's heart pounding against the back of the man who had vowed to protect her, and a tiny child held safe against the heartbeat of the only shield they had left. Ahead lay danger. Ahead lay hope. And ahead lay the thin line between survival and capture, a line Calder Greyhawk intended to cross with them, no matter what followed behind. By midday, the desert had become a living furnace. Heat shimmered across the sand in trembling waves, turning every distant shape into a mirage. Coyote Moon's breaths grew heavier with each mile, and sweat gathered at the base of Evelyn's neck, tracing slow paths down her spine. Samuel whimpered against Calder's chest, his tiny face flushed with the kind of heat no infant should ever have to endure. Calder reached into the small pouch tied at his belt, pulling out a bundle of crushed green leaves wrapped in cloth. "Here," he murmured, placing it in Evelyn's hand. "Break it open. Hold it near him. He'll breathe easier." She did as he said, and the moment the scent drifted into the air, cool, sharp, like crushed mint mixed with desert rain, Samuel's breathing softened. His cries eased into small, tired whimpers. Evelyn let out a shaky breath of relief. "You thought of everything," she said quietly. Calder shook his head. "The desert thought of everything. I'm only borrowing from what it knows." Coyote Moon climbed a low ridge, and for a moment the world expanded wide. Golden, endless. Evelyn felt the exhaustion of the past days settling inside her bones, dragging her forward, almost folding her in half. She swayed. An instinct pulled her forward until her cheek brushed Calder's shoulder. She stiffened immediately. "Sorry," she whispered, but Calder didn't pull away. He nudged the horse gently and said, "Lean if you need to." She hesitated a long heartbeat, then let her weight ease against him. Even through dust and sweat, he radiated a steady warmth that made something deep in her chest unclench. For a brief stretch, all she heard was the rhythm of the horse's hooves and Calder's calm breathing. Finally, her voice rose, soft as a wind-worn prayer. "Calder, why are you helping us?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze swept the horizon, studying light, shadow, wind, everything the desert offered him. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of a man who rarely wasted breath. "Because no child should fear his own father," he said, "and no woman should run alone." Evelyn felt those words anchor themselves inside her. She blinked hard, trying to keep the emotion from spilling over. The wind caught the wetness in her eyes anyway. "Thank you," she whispered. Calder didn't reply, but she felt something in him soften, like a stone warming in sunlight. They descended the ridge, moving into a narrow ravine where a cluster of boulders offered the first sliver of shade they'd seen since morning. "We'll rest here," Calder said. Just for a moment. He slid down first and lifted Samuel from the sling with the gentleness of a man who knew how fragile life could be. Evelyn tried to step down on her own, but pain shot up her ankle the moment her foot touched the ground. She stumbled. Calder caught her one arm around her waist, one steadying her elbow. Their eyes met for just a second, but it was enough to make Evelyn's breath falter. "Easy," he murmured, guiding her into the shadow of the rocks. Her ankle throbbed angrily beneath her weight. "It's nothing," she said, trying to hide the limp. Calder gave her a look that quieted any further protest. "Sit." She lowered herself onto a flat stone, cheeks warm with embarrassment. Calder knelt before her, lifting the hem of her dress only enough to see the injury skin scraped raw. "Swelling just beginning. This ground is cruel," he said. "You've been pushing past your limit." He pulled a strip of cloth from his satchel, tore a small piece, and dabbed it with water. Evelyn winced as he cleaned the wound. "Sorry," he said softly. "Pain means it'll heal. Pain is all I've known lately," she whispered, barely aware the words had escaped her. Calder paused. For a moment, he looked like he might say something, but instead, he continued his careful work, wrapping the cloth around her ankle with practiced skill. "You'll walk better now," he murmured. "Thank you for everything," she said again, voice trembling. Calder finished tying the wrap and sat back on his heels. Sweat trickled down his temple, leaving a dark trail through the dust. Only then, as he reached for his water skin, did Evelyn notice the tear in his shirt along his upper arm, stained dark with blood. Her heart lurched. "Calder, your arm. It's nothing," he said simply. "You're bleeding. I know. From what? Earlier. Climbing the rocks. Scraped it." He shrugged, dismissing it as if it were a thorn prick instead of a wound that had soaked a palm-sized patch of fabric. Evelyn frowned. "Why didn't you tell me?" He glanced up at her, eyes calm and steady. "Because you and the baby needed all the strength between us. My cut can wait." Those words wrapped around Evelyn like a hand on her heart, unexpected and steadying. Before she could answer, Calder's head snapped toward the trail behind them. "What is it?" she whispered. Calder rose slowly, scanning the sand. His body stilled. The air seemed to tighten. He crouched near a patch of ground where the dust had been disturbed not by wind, not by animals, by hooves. Fresh. 5, 6 hours at most. He brushed the print with his fingertips. 3 riders, he said quietly. Maybe 4. They're moving fast. Evelyn felt her breath catch in her throat. They're close, closer than they were this morning. Samuel stirred with a soft cry, as if sensing the rising fear in the air. Calder stood, his voice low, steady, and carved from iron. "We move now," he said, "and we don't look back." He helped Evelyn to her feet and lifted Samuel into the sling once more. Coyote Moon whinnied softly, stamping the ground as if she too felt the danger threading through the desert. Evelyn climbed up behind Calder, her hands gripping him tighter than before, not just out of fear, but out of something deeper, something that whispered, "This man will not let me fall." Calder leaned forward and guided the horse into motion, swift, purposeful, silent. Behind them, the sun beat mercilessly on the sand. Behind them, 3 sets of hoofprints grew warmer, and behind them, danger crept closer with every breath. Night did not fall gently that evening. It dropped hard, like a curtain pulled across the sky, deep, dark, and heavy with danger. By the time the sun had vanished behind the jagged cliffs, Calder had already guided Coyote Moon into a narrow cut between the rocks, a place where most riders would see nothing but shadows. But this canyon was no stranger to him. His father had brought him here as a child, teaching him where the earth hid its safest passages, where the desert opened its arms to those who respected her. This way? Calder murmured, his voice low enough that it barely slipped past his lips. Evelyn clung to him as the horse picked its way deeper into the canyon. The walls rose high on both sides, towering like ancient sentinels, shutting out the moon and trapping the cool night air. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became. So quiet, Evelyn could hear her own heartbeat echoing inside her ears. At last, Calder brought them to a cluster of desert willow trees nestled against the rock face. Their branches hung like thin curtains, and beneath them, hidden by the lay of the ground, was a shallow, natural hollow just large enough for 3 bodies to curl inside. Calder slid from the saddle and lifted Samuel from the sling. The baby whimpered once but didn't cry, a small blessing in a night made of fear. "This is where we stay," Calder said softly. "They won't find us easily." Evelyn followed him into the hollow, lowering herself with Samuel tucked protectively against her chest. The earth was cool beneath her palms, and the smell of the willows carried a faint sweetness that felt strangely comforting despite the terror closing in on them. Calder gathered fallen branches and dry brush without a sound, layering them carefully across the willow curtain to thicken the blind. His movements were silent, precise, guided by instinct older than memory. Evelyn watched him work, realizing with a strange twist in her chest that she trusted him more deeply than she had trusted anyone in years. Not because he was strong, though he was. Not because he was skilled, though he was that too, but because he cared. Quietly, without asking for anything, with a steadiness that felt like shelter. Voices broke the silence. Distant but not distant enough. Evelyn tensed, gripping Samuel until her arms ached. Calder immediately crouched beside her, one hand gently covering Samuel's tiny head, the other steadying her shoulder. The canyon amplified every sound. The clatter of hooves on rock, the low, angry murmur of men, the sharp command of someone who believed he owned the desert and everything breathing within it. Evelyn's breath stuttered. Calder leaned close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, hear the slow, controlled steadiness of his breaths. "They won't find us," he whispered. "Stay still." The riders' voices grew louder. "They passed this way. Look at the ground. Tracks disappear here. Spread out." A flicker of torchlight slashed across the canyon wall, sending long shadows crawling like silent ghosts. Evelyn pressed Samuel to her chest so tightly he let out a small whimper, but Calder's hand was already there, calming him with a soft, rhythmic touch. A rider dismounted. His boots crunched on gravel, slow, deliberate. He walked so close, the sound of his breathing reached them through the willow curtain. Calder shifted, placing himself between the man and Evelyn, his body a quiet shield. The tracker knelt, right above their hiding place. Evelyn couldn't breathe, couldn't blink, could barely think. She felt Calder's hand find hers in the dark. His grip was firm, grounding, telling her without words, "You're not alone. I've got you." The tracker brushed aside sand, searching for signs. He lifted a rock, studied the ground again. Seconds stretched into unbearable eternity. At last, a voice echoed from farther up the canyon. "Anything." The tracker hesitated, then exhaled sharply. No. Wind took the trail. Let's go. His boots stepped back. Mounted, hooves retreated down the canyon. Evelyn sagged against the rock, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. Calder remained still for several long minutes, listening until the last echo of hooves faded into the distance. Only then did he allow his body to relax. They're gone, he murmured. Evelyn swallowed, her voice breaking on a whisper. Calder. He turned to her, and before she could stop herself, her hand reached for his wrist, fingers trembling. Desperate, don't leave us, she said, raw and trembling. Not now, not ever. Calder froze, not in rejection, but in the quiet shock of a man who had not heard such words spoken to him in a very long time. The moonless night pressed around them. Samuel's soft breaths rose and fell. Evelyn's grip on him shook with fear. Calder shifted closer, his presence filling the small hollow with something steady and warm. I'm here, he said. I'm not going anywhere. And he meant it. He adjusted the blanket around Evelyn and Samuel, then lowered himself beside them, his back against the rock, his eyes fixed on the canyon's mouth. Evelyn leaned into him, her head resting just beneath his shoulder. Calder did not sleep, not with danger still prowling somewhere in the dark, but Evelyn. She drifted off with her fingers still wrapped around his wrist, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a world that had turned to dust. And maybe, in that moment, he was. All night, Calder stayed awake, silent, vigilant, immovable, a guardian carved from the desert's own strength. For the first time since her world had shattered, Evelyn slept without fear. Dawn broke like a blade of pale gold across the canyon, slicing through the last shadows of night. Evelyn woke with Samuel tucked against her chest and one hand still wrapped around Calder's wrist. She didn't remember falling asleep. She only remembered the fear and the quiet strength of the man beside her. Calder gently eased his hand free and leaned toward the canyon mouth, listening. The desert was too still, too expectant. They camped near. He murmured, "We move now." Within minutes, they were back on Coyote Moon, riding hard through the winding canyon. The morning air carried the sharp scent of mesquite and something else, dust. Lots of it. Evelyn felt her stomach tighten. Are they close? Closer than dawn should allow, Calder said. They rode all night. The canyon opened into a wide flat, stretching toward the distant border ridge. A long, pale line drawn across the world. If they reached it, they had a chance at freedom. If not, Calder urged the horse faster. But before they were halfway across the flats, he stiffened. Riders. East. Evelyn turned just enough to see them, three dark figures cresting a hill. Sunlight flashing on guns. More dust rising behind them. They're cutting us off, she breathed. Hold tight, Calder said. Coyote Moon surged forward, hooves pounding the earth. The riders behind them kicked up a cloud of dust that rose like a storm. A gunshot cracked the morning. Stones shattered off the canyon wall beside them. Samuel cried, startled by the sound, and Evelyn tightened her arms around him. Down, Calder barked, leaning low over the horse's neck as another bullet screamed past them. The ground sloped sharply into a narrow gulch, its walls jagged and close. Calder steered Coyote Moon into it, letting the canyon swallow them whole. The sudden shade brought a breath of relief until voices echoed behind them. They followed us in, Evelyn gasped. Gunfire ricocheted off rock, sparks kicking into the air. The mare stumbled once on loose shale but kept running, Driven by Calder's steady guidance and sheer will, at the far end of the gulch, the passage narrowed, splintering into two tight cuts. Calder swung his boot hard against a jutting rock, hard enough to dislodge it. The stone cracked free, tumbling down and taking several others with it. A rush of earth and debris poured into the path behind them, blocking the narrow passage. The riders cursed, forced to slow, not stopped, but slowed. They burst out of the gulch. And suddenly the world opened wide again, the border ridge only a few hundred yards ahead. Sunlight spilling over it like salvation. "We're close," Calder said, breath tight, but fate had one more cruelty to deliver. A lone rider galloped in from the right, cutting across their path. His horse skidded to a halt in a whirl of dust. His coat whipped behind him like a banner of rage. Barrett Doyle. Evelyn's breath choked in her throat. "Give me my boy," Barrett roared, drawing a pistol and leveling it straight at Calder. "You can't run from me." Calder reined in Coyote Moon abruptly, forcing the mare to a shaking standstill. Evelyn gripped Samuel so tightly she thought her heart might tear in two. Barrett's eyes were wild, burning with a fury that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with possession. "Hand him over." Barrett snarled. Now, Evelyn's voice rose before Calder could speak raw. Fierce, unbroken. "He's not yours." He never was. Barrett's face twisted. Before he could fire, a shout cracked across the ridge. "Drop the weapon." A line of mounted border guards appeared along the ridge, rifle raised. Their captain spurred forward. "Barrett Doyle," he called. "You're wanted on warrants from 2 counties. Trafficking, assault, fraud. You'll come with us." Barrett swung his pistol toward them, but a chorus of metallic clicks filled the air. 10 rifles trained on him. The rancher froze. Calder didn't move. Evelyn didn't breathe. One guard dismounted, yanked the gun from Barrett's grip, and pinned his arms behind him with iron cuffs. Barrett twisted, spit, screamed threats that dissolved into the morning wind. "This isn't over," he bellowed as they pulled him away. "You'll regret crossing me." But the guards rode off with him, dragging his fury into the distance. And suddenly the desert felt bigger, lighter, free. Evelyn sagged against Calder, tears drying in the sun's warmth. Calder exhaled slowly, his hand steady on her back. "It's over," he murmured. "He can't hurt you now." For the first time in days, Evelyn allowed herself to believe it, allowed her shoulders to drop, allowed her heart to hope. Ahead of them, the border ridge glowed like a doorway to a life they had never dreamed possible. And behind them, dust settled on the last echoes of a chase that had nearly cost everything but ended in freedom. Night settled softly over the border outpost, wrapping the small adobe buildings in a cocoon of quiet. The guards had offered them a room, nothing more than 4 walls and a cot, but to Evelyn it felt like a sanctuary carved out of mercy. She lay down with Samuel curled against her chest. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, sleep took her gently instead of dragging her under. Outside the door, Calder sat beneath the lantern glow, a cracked water gourd resting across his knee. He turned it over with careful hands, smoothing the edges, binding them tight with thin strips of fiber. There was something meditative in the work, something that quieted the ghosts that sometimes pressed too close at night. Every so often, he glanced toward the door to make sure nothing disturbed the woman and child sleeping within. He stayed awake until the stars burned past midnight and the desert night began to cool. Only then did he allow himself to lean back against the adobe wall, his eyes closing not in sleep, but in a rare moment of peace. Dawn came quietly, touching the sky in muted rosé and gold. Evelyn stepped outside with Samuel in her arms, her eyes warm with gratitude and something softer still. Calder rose when he saw her, giving her space but not distance. "You didn't sleep," she said softly. "I slept enough," he replied. "The night treated you kindly." A small smile formed on her lips, fragile, but real. "It did." Calder studied her for a moment, the morning light catching in his dark eyes. Then he spoke in a voice low enough that only she and the waking desert could hear. "Evelyn, now that you're free to choose your own road," he paused, searching her face. "Do you want to walk alone, or walk with someone beside you?" It was not a question asked lightly. Not by him. Not after everything. Evelyn looked down at Samuel, who blinked up at her with half-lidded contentment. Then she looked back at Calder, at the man who had carried her child against his heart, who had fought storms and riders and death itself to keep them safe. "I don't want to walk alone," she said. Her voice didn't tremble this time. "I want to walk with you." Calder bowed his head once, a gesture filled with quiet acceptance and something deeper, a promise unspoken but felt completely. They left the outpost together that morning, heading south toward the broad valley Calder remembered from childhood, a place where the cottonwoods grew thick along a narrow stream, a place untouched by ranchers, riders, or fear. Weeks passed like gentle breaths. They built their home with their own hands, a modest shelter shaped from clay and timber, shaded by the cottonwoods that whispered like old friends in the wind. Samuel's cheeks filled out, his little laugh echoing through the valley like sunlight made sound. Evelyn learned the patterns of the land where the desert mint grew in cool pockets, where the jackrabbits hid, how to read clouds for rain. She laughed again, really laughed one afternoon, when Calder taught her how to crush herbs between smooth stones. The sound startled him at first, as if he'd forgotten how light could sound when it lived inside a person. And at night, when Samuel drifted to sleep, Evelyn would hum faint lullabies she remembered from childhood, songs Calder listened to with reverence, as though each note carried a piece of her soul. In return, he taught her the names of constellations in Apache, their meanings, their stories. She held on to each one like a treasure. One evening, as the sky burned purple and gold, Calder returned from the stream carrying something small wrapped in cloth. He sat beside her on the smooth stone near their doorway, unwrapped the bundle, and held out a wooden pendant carved in the shape of a curved leaf. "My mother made these for the daughters she hoped she'd have," he said. "I kept this one for many years, waiting for a place, a life, a person worthy of it." Evelyn's breath trembled as he lifted the loop of leather and tied it gently around her neck. The pendant rested warm against her skin, light as a whispered vow. "Calder, this feels like home," she said, voice hushed with emotion. He cupped the back of her hand with his own. "Rough against soft." "It is," he answered, "and you are part of it now." Their fingers intertwined as the desert wind moved through the cottonwoods, remembering their names. And now, my friends, if this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your feelings in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from and what part moved you the most. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Eagle Eye Apache for more stories of courage, healing, and the untold love that lived beneath the western skies. Until next time, may the wind guide your steps. and may your heart always find its way home.